This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you. I'd like to call to order the May 10th, 2020 Planning Commission and Board of Commissioners Comprehensive Plan Workshop. First item is the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, do the roll call.
Trevor Dombach. Not here yet. Tim Dugan. Andrew Flagg. Brian Height.
Here.
Diane Kelly.
Here.
Mark Luth. Not present yet. David Wilson.
Here.
Monica Hodges. David Kennedy.
Here.
Brad Osborne.
Here.
Mike Walk. And he is neither in person nor online.
And you do the meeting rules?
Indeed. These meetings are intended to be Planning Commission workshops. The goal of these workshops is to complete the Planning Commission's PA-MPC duty, quote, to prepare the comprehensive plan for the development of the municipality as set forth in this act, MPC, and present it to the consideration of the governing body, unquote. While it is the role of the Planning Commission to prepare the comprehensive plan, to do so without the input of the Board of Commissioners would ultimately reduce the chances of the Board of Commissioners approving the comprehensive plan. Therefore, any input provided by Board of Commission members will be valuable moving forward with the drafting of the comprehensive plan. Please note that this is a hybrid in-person remote meeting. All participants are welcome to verbally give comment during the designated portions of the meeting. For an orderly meeting wherein all attendees may be able to fully participate, we ask that you adhere to the following rules. Please mute your microphone or telephone to avoid background noise that may cause interference in the meeting and make it difficult for others to hear. Staff may mute the microphones of remote attendees if needed. Public questions and comments will be taken at periodic intervals throughout the agenda. We will start with no time limits, but the Planning Commission Chairman may impose a time limitation if there are many questions or if the meeting is running short on time. For in-person attendees, we have none present, please raise your hand to be recognized and then move to the podium when directed and state your name, address, and comment or question. Please turn the podium microphone on before speaking and off when done. For remote attendees, the chat box feature will be active throughout the meeting. If you have a comment or question, please type your full name and address in the chat box, which is indicated by the speech balloon icon in the upper right. When you are recognized and so directed, please unmute your microphone and state your comment or question. Mute your microphone when done. For those who are accessing the meeting by phone only, staff will periodically ask for caller comments and unmute any callers. Callers must identify their name and address prior to making a comment. Your cooperation and adherence to these rules will ensure an orderly and respectful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. It should be noted that Mark Luth has joined us. Since this is a hybrid meeting, I think it is important to also introduce staff in attendance so people watching online know who's in the room from our staff and consultants. So we have David Manhart, our Director of Community Development, Greg Adams, our planner, Lynn Labar is taking our minutes, and we have Hannah Clark from Michael Baker Consultant. And if there's anybody online from staff or anybody, please note that.
Randy Cope is present.
As indicated by our roll call, we have some new members on the Planning Commission, so I would like to formally welcome new Planning Commissioners Timothy Dugan and Andrew Flagg. Next agenda item is the approval of minutes. Are there any corrections or comments?
I'll make a motion to approve.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And abstain.
Minutes from the last planning commission
Workshop. Now we're up to agenda item 5, the comprehensive plan goals and implementation. I will turn it over to Mr. Manhart.
Okay, so tonight is our 4th successful meeting of the Planning Commission workshops where we have the BOC present. The idea is to get input as we're going through this process from the BOC to kind of identify some priorities that BOC may be looking for to help guide the Planning Commission in drafting and coming up with a comprehensive plan. So just as a little bit of background, one of the things, we'll get into the timeline in a little bit, but one of the things that we're working, and part of the strategy of doing the process this way, is we're working on the draft as we go through this process. So there's certain things that I've been working on, Greg's been helping, and now that we brought Michael Baker in on a bigger role, they'll be helping in this drafting. And one of the things that I've been working on is resource mapping. And this really ties into the conversation tonight. I'll just kind of go through real quick, just to kind of show everything that we have available that will be integrated into the comprehensive plan once we get to that point. So we have the where should we protect, which was part of those exercises. This will help us really when we get into the land use mapping. We'll start bringing all these maps together and doing overlays and starting to really put together a land use plan. We have developed areas and undeveloped areas. One of the things I've also been working on is trying to get a historic record of development pressure in the township. There's a data set called National Land Covered Data Set that's been taken by remote sensing, so satellite imagery, since '96. I didn't find the '96 data set, but I found 2001 to 2019. So I have that catalog of development. So it has developed areas, undeveloped areas. So that'll also be worked into the mapping and part of the introduction section.
When you say developed and undeveloped, is undeveloped just vacant parcels or?
So it's remote sensing data, so it's done from a satellite. And you know, they have all kinds of algorithms on how they identify different types of land cover. So it's parcel neutral. So it's not looking at parcel lines at all.
Okay.
So if there's something, a category called developed open space, which typically is like lawn areas or detention basins and things like that. So they have that distinction between open space, well, undeveloped and developed. So that's also baked into that. So I've been kind of working on a chart that shows development pressure, and it'll eventually come before you guys and you'll see that. We have a woodlands layer, and you know, when we get
Hold on
into
1 second. When you say development pressure, that's from the surrounding municipalities?
no,
Just
just
within?
within South Whitehall.
Okay.
Do we have records of, development projects that went through the township since then? I mean, that would be a detailed record of the actual development.
Yeah, we do, and
Sure.
that in the existing conditions report, there is a list of developments since, and I forget how far back we went, probably since 2009, because we were doing an update of the 2009 plan. So we had a full list of all the development projects that happened since 2009. With the data set, Greg and I have been looking at it, and Greg can pretty much look at it and say, oh, that's Blue Barn Meadows, and that's, so, we have a great resource in Greg, and we can kind of start identifying some of those. One of the interesting things is the approved developments, kind of what that does to the trend line. And we'll get into that probably at the next meeting. Yes. So, Tim, welcome to the board. It's very important that you speak into the microphone. It's the only way people online can hear is if it's going through the system.
I can say it again.
Okay.
All right, so looking at resource mapping, are we looking at surrounding municipalities and what their planning is to integrate multi-municipal planning efforts?
So generally, there's a section of the comprehensive plan that talks about interrelationships of other plans, and we do an analysis of other municipalities along the border is generally what you look at. And then the county, Lehigh Valley Planning Commission also looks at the plan for consistency with the county plan. And that's different than multi-municipal planning. That's something else altogether. That's where 2 or more municipalities get together, do an updated comprehensive plan, eventually get to the zoning stage. And that's one of the recommendations that has kind of come in as part of implementation, was to look at multi-municipal planning partners. We had some things in the implementation part of it. So it's something that we're going to consider. Timing, I mean, that would put the brakes on this and take another couple years. But I think it's important to keep it as an option and start the dialogue with the neighboring municipalities.
One difficult thing with multi-municipal plans is that it's a two-way street. It requires cooperation from the other municipalities. So the other municipalities have to be on board. Even if we want to do it 100%, if the other municipality does not, there's nothing we can do about that. What I have seen, more developed townships do like their independence from the neighboring townships. If it's a very, very rural area that does not have the resources to self-regulate and govern, a lot of times they team up together and do a multi-municipal, but a lot of times I've seen more developed townships sort of like their independence.
Yeah, and one of the things with South Whitehall is we're pretty unique because we have a varied land use. North of the ridge is pretty rural, south of the ridge is pretty built up. So that's one thing that's pretty unique about South Whitehall. But I think using this comprehensive plan update, and particularly, so the draft plan will go out to the neighboring municipalities for comment. I think using that as an opportunity to start dialogue is really what it amounts to. So that everybody can start talking about, if we did multi-municipal planning, what would it mean? Things like that. And, there's some ideas that we have, and we can get into implementation items surrounding the multi-municipal plan. With that, I'll just kind of breeze through these maps because I don't want to take too much time and talk all night again.
2 waters.
I do have 2 waters today. We also have steep slope mapping. One of the things, it's taking a little while to catch up there. One of the typically steep slope maps are based on soils, not super accurate. I was able to take what's called LiDAR data, which is much more accurate, and use that as our steep slope layer. I won't get into how I cleaned it up and the intricacies of it, but it's there. Hydrology, floodplains, riparian buffers, floodways, wetlands are all in this layer. Historic sites, these are off of the official map. Yep.
Sorry to interject. Is like karst topography, karst geology included in the hydrology layer?
It's not in the hydrology layer, but we have that mapping available and it'll be brought into it. Historic sites, again, off the official map. One of the implementation things we talked about was reevaluating that list and perhaps adding to that. Agriculture areas, including agricultural soils. So that's all, mapping that's available. Natural heritage areas, which is a wildlife, flora and fauna. So specific, there's a plant species in the Crackersport Road wetlands, and I forget what the animal species is. I think it's a salamander of some sort, are protected or endangered in that habitat. And then we have preserved open space, and this is also from our official map, and we'll need to get updated as we go through it and kind of evaluate in more detail. So just wanted to kind of cover that to show that while we're going through these goals and objectives, we're continuing to work on the plan and develop the plan to kind of keep this thing moving. Which brings me to the timeline. Any questions on the resource mapping or where we're at with any of that? So.
Yes, do you want me to jump in? Okay.
That'd be great, thank you.
So good evening, everybody. It's great to see you again. Michael Baker is very excited to be taking a role in helping the township bring this to the draft and then adoption stage. And we did want to share a more detailed timeline just to illustrate. Those are all the tasks that we have listed, and then how we envision advancing this process, as well as the considerations needed for the MPC adoption. So as Dave was discussing, we really see this draft as beginning. There's inputs and resources that we can begin to pull together, that the township is pulling together, and our team will help weave that into the narrative, particularly around existing conditions, community profile, and really bringing in some of the discussion from the workshops as well, which I know those recommendations are showing up in the considerations. So just to very briefly go through, we have the continued project coordination management. That's just really ensuring that we are working closely with the township to move all this forward. These planning commission workshops, we will be supporting them in the capacity that I am here, as well as able to structure as we go into the draft stage, what support the workshops to review the draft and get that required planning commission VOC and public input. So you can see those are expected to happen on a monthly basis, beginning with in May and then taking us through December. For the public engagement, we had discussed one major public meeting, and it seems most appropriate to have that after these initial workshops, ending with the future land use or the land use discussion. So aiming for a September public workshop that we would have, again, since we are moving the draft forward, we should have a substantive portion of the plan, and we can share that in a way that will be accessible and understandable. And I think these planning commission workshops will help us refine and think through exactly how we want to share that information, as well as how we want to do that. Do we want to do an open house? Do we want to think about a more interactive public meeting? So definitely would love to hear thoughts on that. And then, so again, we've discussed the drafting and how that is a continuous process, and our team will be working closely, utilizing our discussions here to continually build out the plan and integrate a lot of the resources that the township, such as mapping and a lot of the data analysis that's already taken place. So the final piece is the plan adoption. And so we did want to just qualify that expected timeline. It is inclusive of beginning the official public comment period, which is 45 days. During that 45 days is also when, as Dave was discussing, in the neighboring municipalities and other governmental entities will receive the plan for their review, including the LVPC and others. So if we are able to initiate that by on or before October 10th, we should be put on a path that would allow for integration of public comments following the 45-day public comment period. We'd obviously want to make sure that we will be collecting and addressing those throughout the comment period and then presenting them and our recommendations as how they could be applied to the plan in collaboration with the Planning Commission, BOC, and the staff. So we did just want to put that qualifier in there that if it is decided for whatever reason that the public comment period may be later in October or later in the fall, we should just readjust the expected final timeline for adoption just due to the required public hearing that will need to happen for the BOC to officially adopt it after the public comment period has closed, as well as the option to have the Planning Commission make the recommendation to the BOC for adoption after that 45-day public comment period. So happy to provide more detail. I know you did review our scope last week, and very happy to discuss any pieces there as well.
There's a few months that it's gonna fly by. It's gonna pass us before you know it.
3 years has flown by.
I think September is a good month because most vacations are over. You have full attendance. Really good.
So in one of the things that ties into this next piece, so the workshops are built around these topic areas of the comprehensive plan. So we have statement of goals and objectives, which we've already completed. There's draft goals, statement of goals and objectives on the website. There's a comment form on that. We have to get that out a little bit more, but that's there. Then we go into resource protection, which we're reviewing tonight. We have some draft goals and objectives we want to review with everybody. And then once we get the okay, we can put those on the website for comment. And then we'll get into community utilities. And the way we're doing this is we're reviewing all of the material that we have available, and then discussing it, and then Planning Commission prioritizes. So that gets us through tonight. So for June, we're hoping to get through housing and community facilities. We'll do that in one night, and then we'll have transportation in July. And then that brings us to land use in August. So that's kind of how that'll flow. And then once we get through August, that puts us into September to kind of start having everything put together. So that kind of gives that broad picture. The other piece of this is once we get through the mapping and the land use portion, is we had the economic model and then the transportation model. Once we get that land use plan, at least in a draft form that everybody's relatively comfortable with, we'll send that off to the models to run through the models. Then we'll evaluate the impacts of this new land use plan. This is kind of the piece where if things come back from that model and there's red flags, we may have to go back in and start, fine tuning, and that is just going to push things back. But I think it's important to understand impacts. And this is something that we've talked about a lot during this process, is the impacts of development, the impacts of preservation. So getting those into a model is very important so that we can kind of get a better understanding of what those potential impacts are. Once we get through that, we put everything together and then we're done, right? So for each of these workshops, we'll start off by reviewing any public comment we received. Then we'll go over the synthesized goals and objectives. That would be what we did at the last meeting. Then we have an open comment period, and then we look for, it's an informal approval to post these on the website to get additional comment. So public comment review, this is just kind of a running list. We did get one comment from the website. There were more questions If you G1 and G2 are refer to the goals. So G1, the question was, will it include surrounding townships and the city? It certainly gets worked into the process through the interrelationship statement, and then also through public comment. And then the G2 is the goal that dealt with the infrastructure. And he brings up a great point about upgrading and modernizing infrastructure. So that's something we can absolutely build into that section. And I suspect that will come up in conversation tonight as we go through community utilities. And then S4 was the reexamination report. The statement was just periodically, and that's up for discussion of what periodically means, whether it's annually, biannually, still be worked out. So the good news is the form works. So that's a good thing. So once we get resource protection up, the plan is to put that out there again, and then also have the overall goals and objectives as part of that outreach. So that brings us to the review of synthesized goals. So at the last meeting, resource protection was probably the most difficult one to get through because there were so many goals and strategies and statements. So it was really important for us. And this was the one where we had the meeting that we had to cancel because of the technical difficulties. So it was a bit of a challenge to go through everything without that public comment. So at the last meeting, we discussed these resource protection. After that meeting, we met as staff and kind of tried to simplify. There was a lot in there. So we did a pretty intensive effort to simplify everything. We categorized, we cut out all of the goals, and we're putting them on the board and stacking them together. And so we came up with, we're all pretty happy with how it turned out, but this is again for comment. The overall goal is to preserve and protect resources that are important to the unique characteristics of the township. Pretty broad, overarching, kind of talks about, resources and the importance of those resources. So I don't know, do we think it's best to do how about we just, if anybody has comments, jump in, stop me from talking, please. So if anybody has comments on, one way or the other, just jump in. Otherwise, I'll just keep going and I'll probably talk all night. But so that was the overall goal. And then so then we looked at strategies. And again, this is for all of resource protection. Identify and prioritize resources that are important to the unique characteristics of the township. So it kind of refers to that overarching goal, but has some action items associated with it.
Now, as a township, do we already have an official map
Yes.
or mapping that sort of identifies these natural resources already?
Some are on there. Yes.
And I guess is the goal to revise that based on these?
Yeah, so
workshops?
the official map update is actually in the implementation tab. So one of the other things that came out of all of this public outreach is the importance of an implementable plan and having that implementation plan. So we're trying to keep strategies, broad, and the fine tuning and the specific tasks are in the implementation. So updating the official map is absolutely on that implementation plan. So strategy 2, strengthen township regulations to encourage and incentivize preservation of resources. So again, tying it back to the goal with some action items. And this can mean, we'll get into some details of what this can mean. The third is to actively pursue partnerships and opportunities to preserve resources. So you'll notice the theme where we're adding these action items into these strategies. And then this is one that kind of came out of the last meeting. It was actually 2 of them. So direct development to areas with access to infrastructure and limit development in hazard-prone areas. So this kind of ties to the strength and regulations. You can change zoning so that you're encouraging density in areas with infrastructure and limit development in natural resource protection areas. So then what we did is we looked at each specific area. So we have agriculture as a topic area. So we took each of those action items. So identify and prioritize. What do we want to identify and prioritize? We talked about shifts in modern agriculture. Identifying and prioritizing agriculturally significant areas, identifying potential sites to support small to medium scale operations, and then also economic development opportunities related to agriculture and opportunities to support a local food system. So these are kind of all items that, you know, you start off by identifying and prioritizing, and then you move on to that next step, where we encourage and incentivize. So we look at updating regulations. Transfer of development rights is a way to protect areas of agriculture, but that requires the sending and receiving, the compromise piece, and you know, you need to have 2 areas for that to work.
I'd like to comment on that because that's in my opinion a big ticket item, and it's a great way to preserve land, but also it results in the receiving area being more dense. So again, it's that whole 2-way street. So I think that is going to be a big ticket item, and that's something we really need to communicate with the residents in our township so they understand that. And is that something we want to investigate farther and consider? Because there's a lot of agriculture that is open that, you know, we do want to preserve. And if we use this transfer of development rights to preserve it, the receiving land will be more dense. Is that something acceptable to our residents?
I agree, because we could have a whole workshop just on transfer of development rights.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that kind of ties the comp plan and the role of the comprehensive plan is to kind of identify these topic areas. And then, you know, it sets the stage for the TDR ordinance discussion, workshops. If we need to do a TDR plan, it identifies all of that. And I kind of see the topic of transfer of development rights really coming into the forefront when we get into the land use mapping, because we'll be looking at areas of the township that are, you know, most suitable for preservation and are suitable for development. What does that development look like? Can it sustain increases in density? And those are all conversations that we'll get to at the land use piece of it. And I kind of see all of this conversation setting the stage for all of that. So patience.
David,
Yes.
I don't know the answer. Is TDR outlined in the municipality's planning code? Is there a certain amount? Does it need to be included?
So it's a tool. I don't know that it's explicitly in the MPC, but it's a common planning tool used throughout the country. Lancaster County is a adopter of it, and they have a very successful program. So it's one of the things you'll hear me say a lot is the tools in a planner's toolbox. This is one of those major tools that we can use.
I just wasn't sure if it was outlined in the MPC.
I don't think it's in the MPC, but I don't think it is.
I think, clustering is a important topic to discuss as well. You have a piece of land, have the buildings closer together, a little more dense, and then therefore you can have more of a buffer along the streets. That's something that we discussed further.
Yeah, and again, there's a lot. The comprehensive plan has a ton in it, so there's a lot of stuff that we have to. The idea is to identify things that we want to investigate and dig deeper into, and then when it comes time to dig in, and if it's a priority, we'll have this list, and we'll filter through it, and we're going to have some priorities coming out of this, and we're going to have to jump on them pretty quickly. So I see these conversations evolving and growing as we proceed.
I mean, cluster can really only be done where you have water and sewer for the most part. So we're limited to south of the ridge anyway, which is your generally higher density areas. So I don't know that you have that much left to do cluster, but if we're going to we focus down there on that. Identify areas that could have a cluster alternative.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. And if there's, there's creative ways to do clustering. And like we have 3-acre zoning, and maybe the incentive is 1-acre lots that can support a septic. Those are conversations that we can have when we get to the land use and the zoning piece of it.
With investigation, since you brought up the term, I think it's going to be imperative that we all understand from the Planning Commission and the Board of Commissioners the impacts to transfer development rights. Because learning from the last comp plan, the overlay districts, there are certain conversations going on that's not what was intended or what was intended. So I think it's really imperative that we really understand what that tool can enable.
Absolutely.
And I think to that end, to educate the public as well, because it's one thing for us to discuss it, but if this is something we're proposing for the community so that they understand what's coming in this comp plan and what that means as an impact from
right.
their
And
perspective.
so a lot of these, and we'll see it when we're on the implementation, a lot of the regulations or the programs, so TDR is kind of a program, they're going to involve ordinance updates. So there's going to be public outreach surrounding those as we launch something like that off the ground. So there's going to be plenty, I hope. And it's not something to be taken lightly. It absolutely has to be discussed and vetted. And I think that's one of the important things of having the models available is we can kind of model some of these potential scenarios of this transfer of development rights should we move forward with it. What's increased density in this area look like? Can it sustain it? And things like that.
And also all the agri uses, agri zoning that could have impacts that I've heard horror stories of other municipalities running into issues where they're trying to encourage it, but there's a balance of when it becomes an amusement park versus agritainment, agri-zoning, whatever.
Grimm's Orchard.
I was trying not to mention the catapults, but but there are lessons to be learned from other municipalities, which is to our advantage.
Yeah, and agricultural uses, we will certainly go through and define, because to me there's high intensity agritourism And then there's lower intensity agritourism, you know, kind of like a wedding, which is, you know, on weekends only and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of nuances and there's a lot to this. And then we identified partnerships and opportunities surrounding agriculture. So we have the Lehigh County Agriculture Program. Donna Wright was here at the preservation workshop. There's a Clean and Green program, which is a state program. I have to get more information on that. There's the seed farm, and I think Hannah can talk to that a little bit more. Rodale Farm, and then also landowners and farmers. One of the things that was talked about in, I believe it was the working groups, was the reaching out and educating. So I think that's a very important piece of this, to educate landowners, farmers, of what tools are available to help them. Yeah.
Caller 1, do you have any comments to make on the what you've heard so far?
No, I don't.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, one other thing there on the agricultural section, with farmers, will there be a component there? So one of the reductions for feasibility of farming is their disconnect from their service industry. Yeah, so they're disconnected from feed mills and mechanics and whoever else they need. So I think that may be something else to keep in mind when we look at the mapping in the larger scheme about connectivity to more agrarian surrounding townships and areas, to see if it is functionally feasible.
Yeah, and that's one of the things at the last meeting, we did kind of talk about some of these shifts in modern agriculture. You know, especially in the Lehigh Valley, the large, super large industrial farms are kind of hard to pull off with the development pressure, and then you get left with these pocket farms, and getting equipment to those becomes more and more of a challenge. Absolutely, Tom.
Yeah, it seems like successful farming is either it's on both ends of the spectrum, very large, or it's becoming pocket, more small operation that's able to make it work.
Well, I know in our last meeting, the seed farm, which is a learning farm, I think folks were generally aware of it, as well as Rodale. We saw that as a potential, because I know they have a priority for creating the pipeline of next generation of farmers. So, and I think it was also mentioned LCTI and some of the other vocational schools could also be resources. And to your point, it's not just the farming itself, it's the mechanics who support the equipment, it's those who are, supplying the necessary feed and fertilizers and all of that. So I think when we talk about partnerships and opportunities, hopefully it would be introducing some of those maybe in a more substantive way to the township.
So we can jump into historic. We kind of talked about this with the map, and at previous meetings there's a lot of questions about what is historic. It's kind of along the lines of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. One thing historic to one person may not be historic to another. So it's important to actually have that definition so that everybody moving forward is on that same page. When South Whitehall is talking about historic, this is what South Whitehall means by the term. Identify historic properties. We have the list from the official map. There's other resources out there that we will go through and start compiling those lists. The other piece, I'll get into it a little later, but these sheets actually become an outline for a historic preservation plan or agriculture preservation plan. Kind of lay the groundwork for this is what a plan should do and look at. So again, the idea of the comprehensive plan, setting the stage for other actions down the road, is another really important piece of this. During the conversations at the last meeting, we talked about adaptive reuse and rehabilitation of structures and encouraging that, because one of the things was maintenance of structures. Item there, ensuring long-term maintenance of structures. Structures are maintained if they're occupied. So encouraging that occupation of those structures. Whether it's some sort of adaptive reuse, some sort of light commercial use, or home-based business kind of thing. There's all kinds of opportunities and things that we can talk about with regards to that. Under the partnerships and opportunities, Drexler Trust came up. Again, property owners are going to be a big, that education and that outreach. Lehigh County Historical Society. And there's been talk, and we've talked about a township-based commission or committee. So a historic preservation committee, I believe there was one several years ago. Details, but again, these are things that we can look into to move forward with.
I do have a question about historic preservation. So what I've seen in some municipalities, buildings are listed as historic buildings, and yes, they're historic buildings, but at the end of the day, the regulations don't really have any teeth to preserve that historic building. So I guess maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but you know, are we going to tabulate what we consider the historic buildings and then try to implement a plan that requires the preservation, or is it just something that says, oh, these are the historic buildings, they're nice, but if someone wants to come in and demo them, come in and demo them?
Sure. Within the last 10 or 15 years, we passed a historic resources ordinance. Specifically, the King George was what was in mind. However, it does apply across the township. That one has teeth because the property owner voluntarily enters into an agreement with the township that they must maintain the building in a certain manner. Generally, I believe they look at the National Historic, the Registry of Historic Places, and use their maintenance requirements for it. So this is something that if the property owner does want to enter into that agreement with the township, because there are incentives to do it, then the township, they're entering into a legal agreement that can be enforced by the township. They need to maintain that, which is,
Great.
that is great.
But that's only voluntary, correct? Like in the King George case, they could have ripped that down
Absolutely.
the day after you bought it.
Yep, this ordinance is completely voluntary. Now,
Something we
once
could
again,
review.
it's a spectrum. So this one tends to be more on the teethier side of the spectrum than some of the other ordinances that are out there. So
The owner could have still knocked it down if he wanted to.
before entering into the agreement, yes.
Correct.
But he chose to voluntarily enter into that. We're now finalizing that agreement. So once that happens, he is liable to maintain that building.
What pushes them to enter into that agreement? Because I could see someone say, oh, I don't want to enter into the agreement. It's too much of a pain to serve the building. I'm just going to knock it down.
Absolutely. There are incentives built into the ordinance. Basically, adaptive reuse is one of them. Zoning incentives, I believe, in that particular location in the zoning district, they got incentives to additional height, additional size to the structures associated on the property. So there are definitely zoning incentives that were built into that ordinance.
So is that give and take?
Indeed. Yep.
And that, again, that talks to that middle column there, encourage and incentivize. So, through regulations, again, the tools in our toolbox, the idea is to incentivize or put the carrots out there. Maybe it's a list of other uses that aren't typically available in that zone is another example, to encourage those adaptive reuses. Again, to get those structures occupied, I think is the rationale behind it and the reason to incentivize some of this, to get those things used. And I think using the definition of historic is important as well, because, some like the historic review committees and some of the real historic municipalities or districts have very strict regulations on what you can and can't do. So finding that balance between, what you can and can't do and what maintains that historic character is important to identify once we get into this part of the process.
On the partnerships and opportunities, have you done any research looking like on a larger scale, like outside of the region, the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission, or like the Covered Bridge historical route as an aspect that could be some essence of a tourism driver? I know that is predominantly municipal or state-owned bridges, but there's all those attributes along the way that could be incentivized.
Yeah, and so one of the things is the Jordan Creek Greenway, because there's a lot of historic structures along the proposed path of the Greenway. The idea of kind of marketing it towards that historic tourism piece of it has been talked about as part of the Greenway. I have reached out to, but it's a Doylestown Conservancy, Nature Conservancy, Heritage. Conservancy. Yes. So I reached out to them because they have a building that they maintain, rent out, and I wanted to get an idea of what process they use to do that. So we reached out to them as a possible partner, when we start looking at some of these opportunities.
Okay. Come on. Come on. There we go. Caller one, any comments on the historical resources part?
No. No.
Thank you.
So on to natural. This is really the series of maps I showed. Woodland, steep slope, riparian areas, critical habitat, and others. There's, one of the things we'll do is look at LVPC and use a lot of the same layers that they used when they started evaluating. Karst is a piece of that. So one of the things that, when we had LVPC in as one of the workshops was, they've gone through this process, they've done it for the region, we can do it for the township and kind of evaluate it on a finer scale than the regional scale. So using that same model, so to speak, as a way to identify and prioritize areas. encourage and incentivize. So update ordinances. This was one of the, when we were cutting and playing with all the paper, we had a stack pretty large about all the ordinances to update as part of this encourage and incentivize and regulate natural areas. Steep slopes, riparian buffer, floodplains, woodlands, I mean, the list goes on. And again, one of the things, we should put this in partners and partnerships and opportunities, is the LVPC. They have model regulations and model ordinances on a lot of this conservation. Their steep slope ordinance is one of the best in the state, the model ordinance. So using those model ordinances is another way to get through a lot of the challenges of developing an ordinance. You have the template right there. Also encouraging and incentivize greenways and natural corridors. So we talked about the Jordan Creek Greenway. The other important part is natural corridors. So for wildlife, contiguous woodlands, for example, is a very important piece for woodland wildlife. So identifying that and prioritizing that into this section of the plan. Partnerships and opportunities, Wildlands Conservancy, DCNR. There's the Forest Stewardship Program. We have a patch of forest in the township that's part of this Forest Stewardship Program. So they really work with the forester to evaluate the forest and improve it through different techniques. And then again, partnership and the importance of property owners and getting property owners on board to get involved in some of these programs.
Sorry, I feel like I'm talking too much.
Me too.
I'll give you a break. I saw in some of the comments, I think from some of the other information I was researching, where they talked about climate change or resilience. Is that something that you think would fit in here, or do you have another spot where it may go better?
So one of the things that we've talked about for climate change and resiliency is to kind of, and sustainability, I think were the three things that we were talking about, is to kind of interweave it into the whole plan as a theme that kind of goes in and out. Because with sustainability and climate resiliency, it's such a broad topic and it hits almost every one of these. So there's a comment that come out of it, each one of these sections, that talks about what impacts that may have on resiliency. So we kind of lean, because of the broad nature of it, we kind of thought it would be a good theme to kind of weave through the entire plan rather than just having a specific section on it. But we have to get through that and kind of figure out where it ends up fitting best.
FEMA is a great resource
FEMA.
for floodplains. DEP for riparian buffers.
Hey, Dave, it's Randy. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm also wondering if under partnerships and opportunities, we could include Lehigh County as well as neighboring municipalities.
Thank you, Randy. So another thing that came up in discussions kind of throughout this whole process, we heard from the beginning and a lot of the workshops and the exercise we did was preserving scenic areas. The idea of when you're driving on Cedar Crest North, you kind of have that view, or up here on Ridgeview, you crest the ridge and you have that view. So identifying those areas that are important to the township, and that kind of ties back to that first goal. Identifying these sections or places where there's an important view, including that as a resource worthy of protection. So the first part of that is identifying those significant view sheds. It could be a big view shed from like Kohler Ridge Park. Up the top there, you have a great view out north. Or it could be a smaller view shed, so a development coming in alongside a road, building that visual buffer between the road and the backs of the houses is another piece that fits into this. So looking at encourage and incentivize, we talk about visual buffer provisions, increasing the strength and the teeth in that as well, you know, and whether it's incentives or regulations we can put in there. Height restrictions in certain areas. So if you're looking out and you have that view, you don't want a 10-story building in the way. Not that we'd have 10-story buildings, but just something to consider and think about as we go through this. And one of the things that you can do is you can put a scenic resource overlay into that view shed, and then certain things have to be considered as developments come through that process. Again, this is down the road, but it's a concept that we want to kind of build into here.
Are you talking a view from a public piece of land?
From yes, or a right of way. Yeah. So
You would limit a landowner's ability to build something
potentially
in a public view.
Potentially, yes. So it's been used in areas like the Hudson Valley is an area where they have scenic view overlays, where, you know, they evaluate the view and, you know, buildings can't go over that view line, or they have to be tucked around the corner of the building. So again, there's all kinds of semantics in it, and, you know, have to figure it out. And again, all of these recommendations have to go through the process.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not like if it's in the comp plan, it's going to happen. It has to go through the public process. And it could be, it's not worth doing, but, you know, putting all of this into the comprehensive plan so that their options are available. When we talk about the implementation piece of it and the implementable plan, if something's investigated and it doesn't work out, documenting why it didn't work out. So, you know, and it may be appropriate in some places and not in others. So those are all things to consider as we go through all of these recommendations. I'm on to model 2. Partnerships and opportunities, developers, landowners, Wildlands Conservancy is another one we talked about. The other piece of this is, you know, I mentioned Hudson Valley, for example, going to areas that have already implemented things and using what they did and finding out what worked and what didn't, and, you know, adapting what they used to our situation is another partnership opportunity. So calling up the Hudson Valley and digging up and looking at their ordinance, talking to them to find out what worked and what didn't is an important piece of this.
Yeah, I'm not overly familiar with, you know, scenic overviews and stuff. So that would be, at least for me, and I'm assuming for others, good to see what someone else done.
Yeah, and, you know, case studies is one of the things that maybe this is the section where we just use the case study to talk about it and introduce the idea as something that was worth potentially investigating.
I just don't want to see it. Well, when I look out my window, I see a cornfield now. And now there's going to be a house there. So you're infringing on my scenic vista. by developing that land.
Yeah, there's definitely a balance. So I think, and that's where identifying the significant view shed. So if there's, I think, like when you're up on Ridge View, you look out and you see the ridge. The idea is to keep things below that view line. So it would be a height restriction. So you can't go over into that view is the concept. But yeah, like, is it a significant view? If out my back window, I see a cornfield, it is significant to that person. Is it significant to the township as a whole? Is it worth regulating? Those are all questions that have to be vetted.
Caller 1, any comments on natural or scenic?
Yes, I have a question. What is riparian area?
What is riparian area?
The riparian area is basically an area around a water body. So think of stream banks, is probably the easiest way to think about it, or stream banks, and then there's a certain amount beyond that. In general, I think the LVPC model regulations, I think, have used 75 feet from the center line, is what they define as a riparian area, but I have to clarify that.
Thank you.
So anything else? So I think before we get into implementation, the other piece of this is we want to get the feeling from the boards whether the direction we're heading on this layout is the right way, if there's any flags or any reason why we shouldn't put this on the website and get additional. So I think now is a good time to have that discussion. If anybody has any thoughts.
I know, speaking for myself, I'll probably be emailing in a couple days when I think of more partnerships and opportunities. A lot of times you think when you're driving, like even thinking of scenic views, and that might be a good partner because they control a lot of, majority of the right of way is theirs. We can get them to, instead of putting up signs, strategically put them and not hack out all the trees. There are opportunities there that, yeah, I gotta think outside of the box in order to capture them all.
And if I can just, as we go into the implementation or suggested implementation mechanisms, in terms of building it out, we'd want to identify partners in the context of implementation for these and potentially funding sources. And that was something that we began to do in the working groups as we built out recommendations, timelines, as well as the short, medium, long term. So the partnerships and opportunities, I think there's a layer where it comes in as the strategy, and then also identifying those folks specifically around implementation items, which would be across the board for the plan.
Dave, just to pick up on the partnerships and opportunities under scenic, pick up what Brian said also, your utility companies should be under there. So they're not putting something, that's obnoxious to a landowner looking out their back window and seeing something that, they would think isn't, but, the township or the residents in that area would. So I think that, not that I've seen it, but it's certainly worth an opportunity to put them on as partnerships.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it's just having the seat at the table, like with the utilities and PennDOT, so that you can have those conversations is an important piece of it.
Scenic could also be nighttime lighting regulations, that you, dark skies, all that kind of stuff. There's there's lots of tools in the toolbox. Oh, that we could add in, that we can borrow.
Dave, sorry to interrupt, but I actually, one behind, I wanted to add under agriculture, partnerships and opportunities. I think it was mentioned last time, St. Luke's, because Anderson campus had that, and we partner with St. Luke's for a lot of different things. So St. Luke's might be a valuable agricultural partnership for us. So sorry that I'm going backward. Thank you.
And Brian kind of mentioned it. So one of the things of having these items all laid out is the ability to put them on the website quickly, so that as you guys are thinking about it on your drive home or whenever, you can pop on the website and just plop in the comment, how we want this. Because a lot of times you'll be driving home, oh, I should have talked about this, or I should have mentioned. So that's the idea behind getting that.
So it's okay for us to use those comment forms. Okay.
There's a section at the bottom where we ask for the contact information. So we ask for the address and name. The last comment we just got an address. So it was a resident, kind of what we're trying to get from those comments.
Dave, is there a way to put that form more prominent on the homepage? Because I don't know that a lot of people are going to dig through the CD department links to get to where we're
We
going.
had it as a news item, but we'll have to double check, and because a lot of times as news items gets added, it falls down. But when we put resource protection, we'll put it back up at the top. And then I also think, I've been thinking about the slides, so the big banner. I think I have one, or I used to have a comp plan one. So that's probably a good spot to put all of these updates happening. So it'll roll through. I may lose the battle and I may not be first, but at least I'll get it in there, in the circulation.
Sounds good.
So with implementation, there's a lot there. And a lot of it is going, there's going to be overlap. And the idea with implementation and the implementation plan is to have an actual implementation plan where all of these items we have a one-page kind of information sheet on what the implementation item is, similar to what was developed out of the working groups. So I don't have an example right here, but each of the working group recommendations kind of built out what's involved in funding sources.
Yeah, the goal, the action items, partners, funding sources, implementation timeline. So just really building it so it can be utilized in grant applications if that's how this could get implemented, or as a roadmap for how to get these things done.
What do the resources initials mean? OA.
A is agriculture. I think O is overall. H is historic, N is natural. Yeah.
I think we need to spell them out.
At
least have some sort of key.
Yeah, so there's a lot in here, and as we've been going through, there's a lot. And as we build them out and start looking at priorities and finding the overlap, the idea is to have the one-page sheet on each one of these that'll be built out and spelled out. Yeah, that was just shorthand.
Yeah, the key is to make it user-friendly to 8th grade, that anybody can understand it.
Yeah, and the other piece of it is, in addition to that, is, in 5 years, 10 years, commissioners, planning commission are able to pick it up, and they'll have exactly what you guys were thinking, what was behind that.
that's very important. 'Cause
Yes.
to be fair, I've read the 2009 comp plan, and there's some, I scratch my head sometimes, and I've been on this board 12 years. So it's, that's very important that it lives, even previous chapters, that it's continually
We
refining it.
we really need to document public feedback or lack of public feedback. Because 5, 10 years from now, when people say, why did you do this? Why did you do that? We need to have a record of the feedback, the record of how we have been proactive about reaching out to everyone.
How many meetings, how many times we.
There's no one here. There's no one
That's-
here.
and there's- How many people are online other than Randy?
Have you used social media at all? I mean, I see the police department on there a lot.
Yes, so admittedly, not as much as I should. But now that Michael Baker's on, that's going to be a priority. So we have additional staff to help get that word out. And the piece to, documenting what was done is that re-examination report where we look at whatever the period is. We have that documentation as to this implementation item was brought forward. We talked about it at X number of meetings. This number of public was there. So there's all things that can be built into the reporting of each of these items for the future boards and commissions.
To that end, just to build off that question about social media, we're looking at September as a public engagement meeting. I think it's, we need to be realistic that all of a sudden in September, we're not going to have a room full of people. So how do we build starting now to engage the community that we're working on this? And that's our target date. And we really do want them to, even if they're not available for all the meetings leading to that, maybe to make room, save the date, so to speak, to really build some, I'm almost going to use the word excitement to, we need the community to come and partner with us. And I think that if we do that creatively and routinely, hopefully we'll get a good turnout and have a true sense of what the community is looking for.
And I think we can, the land use, when we get into land use and mapping, that's, people typically will understand that a little bit more and get more excited about that. One of the things we talked about was if one of the goals was identify character areas or neighborhoods and having meetings in those neighborhoods to get the feedback of that neighborhood, to talk about how they want to move forward with not only their area, but other areas as well. Is one of the things we talked about because it worked when we were doing the dot exercise. We had a meeting in each 4 sections of the township at the elementary schools mostly. And that worked pretty well. So I think doing some sort of exercise around that. The other piece is, all the parks programs, movies in the park and things like that. Whiteboard or something available. QR code with a link to a survey, or at least that comment form would probably be.
I think another resource that we should tap into is our retirement communities. They have a lot to say sometimes. They've lived all the change from when it was just South Whitehall High School to now it's Parkland School District. And eventually we're all going to be their age. So sometimes they're very valuable. Because as far as getting out and about and mobility, and so I think, like Luther Crest and all those, they're always looking for activities. We could tap into that as well.
And I think a good way to reach that group, particular group is, I know we've talked about this before with different departments, but utility bills. I mean, they all get them, and if there's a way to engage them about a meeting, or if there's a survey or something, they're probably not prone to go on social media so much, but good point, Brian.
We have HOAs and got a lot of little small community groups that utilize for the betterment of the community.
And I do just want to add that one of the ways we will support public engagement is we can, and it's built into what we're proposing, a public engagement communications plan. So particularly for this phase, for where we are now, and then using the September public meeting as, what's the big push 4 weeks before that. So, we can craft social media posts, obviously, different things you can put on Instagram or Facebook that's very easily digestible digitally, as well as designing things for the utility bills or paper handouts, identifying events to leverage. I do think now is the time to really build community awareness and buy-in, so you are able to have that holistic approach.
Have we done anything with the Parkland Library?
We were going to use that as the pizza box
Right.
location, and then
COVID.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people that utilize that.
Yeah.
Won't come
and
into this building, but they'll go into that building.
I would just like to say I'm very happy that Hannah and her team is on board to help with this. So thank you. It's definitely been difficult and challenging to get everything together. So I'm really looking forward to working with Hannah and getting more engagement.
Even a small poster at the library.
Yeah, what's going through my head right now is a small poster with a QR code that takes you to a web page with all the comment forms is pretty easy and achievable.
But you also need some handouts for the people that don't have
that, yes.
One of the things I was just thinking too, Dave, is with all the sports fields around, with all the kids playing, the kids couldn't care less, but all their parents are there watching them play.
Mhm.
And they're all, not all, but there's a good majority of South Whitehall residents in that group. Literally, if we took a flyer and just handed it out at the ball fields, I mean, it sounds corny, but you know what? They're the young parents, because the kids are playing. So in 10, 15 years, like David said, and you said, Brian, they can't look back and say, geez, what did this BOC and this planning commission do 10 years ago? Well, wait a minute. You lived here 10 years ago. You lived here 15 years ago. So, if we make sure there's no sporting event that night in September, well, I know it's probably planned already because it's just, second Tuesday or whatever it is. So the parents can come out and say, hey, you got to entice them to come out somehow, because it's their future. It's their community in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the road. You go to as you said, with the nursing homes and the senior citizen, retired people, where were they in 09? So they can come out and complain, but where were they in 09? And as David said earlier, it's not only who shows up, but who doesn't show up, so that they can't come back and say, and it's documented that where were you? So I think, hell, I'd go to a sporting event and pass down a flyer to the parents. They're going to say, oh, I'm in North Whitehall. Okay, fine. But, people will take them. You just get the date out there at least. So that's it.
That's a great idea, because that's honestly the hardest demographic to get, is the parents with the kids, because they're constantly running them around to sporting events and activities. And yeah, that's a great idea.
There has to be I hate to say it, but there's got to be almost a babysitting aspect of it, because how many times have we heard, well, I can't make it because I've got a young kid at home. And I understand that. If you have a baby at home, you're not going to drag the baby out. I understand that on a weeknight, in the evening. And I don't know the answer to that. I know that, I don't know if I'd drag out a 6-month-old. But again, somehow we have to connect to them because, you know, those kids are going to grow up in this community. So just,
And as far as public engagement, we actually had really good results with the How Should We Grow survey, the postcard that went out with the QR code. 600 respondents, which is pretty good for a survey like that. So I think having that information blast, like you're saying on a flyer, information blast with a link to something else is really helpful. And, you know, at a sporting event or a movie in the park, they can jump on their phone and fill out a survey, get more information.
Does township staff have contact info for the different residential subdivisions in the township? Who's on the HOAs? Like
Some, yes.
I'm on my master board and HOA, and we have about 330 units, and we're right by the Vistas Park. So
we can give
township-
you flyers.
Yeah, the township contacts me, and then I relay the info to our HOA, and then we do the email blast out to our residents. So it's a good setup. So if, you know, the township had the HOA boards for these different residential subdivisions, that would help a lot.
And
It's a good question for Hannah. Is that an avenue that you've ever explored to go through HOAs to disperse information that way?
I think, well, I'm thinking my experience in the city of Valentine, where HOAs are not super common there. But no, I think that when you similarly think to how neighborhood groups operate, I think that is definitely, you know, there are folks who are very invested in their community to a certain extent. And if it's coming out as well from like a trusted source, if it's from their board leadership, that would also, I think, really assist in getting them to pay attention to it. So I would say start these just begin it now, or we'll create a plan and begin these awareness building, because what you don't want is to throw out a save the date, have all these people show up and not know what you're going to be talking about. So I think there's great opportunities to educate, build awareness, get input, get buy-in, and then use, you know, the summer months. There's lots of outdoor events and activities. And then, you know, mail out maybe a save the date in the 3 weeks before. But yeah, I think we should definitely put that within the public engagement strategy. That's a very unique way and a good resource.
Yeah,
At least with my development, send bills to the property management company, correspondence. So someone could reach out to that property management company and say, hey, who's on your HOA? And then
we can get that contact info. I kind of like the way this is building, because building awareness and having that big meeting at the end, I think, is, especially with all of these activities coming up, and kind of planting those seeds and kind of moving it forward for that big event, is a tremendous opportunity. And all of these avenues for outreach is great. Thank you.
One other aspect, not just for this plan, but for the township as a whole. You walk in here, we got the bulletin board now right outside the door. An awesome spot for another one of those, I don't know what the budget is to put up one of those, would be the playground at Cover Bridge Park. That is a beehive of activity with parents just looking for something to do. I watch them on their phone, and I was down there picking up the counter, but 6 o'clock on a Monday, it's packed. So that's another where they won't come to this building, but they'll go to that park. You're reaching people that, now some of them are not from this township, but you can't help that. But at least that's another avenue that we could potentially pursue. And I know the LVPC, for a lot of their multi-municipal plans, they actually built yard signs with QR codes and put them out for various multi-municipal plans.
We might have to run that by the zoning officer.
But I would just agree with you that pop-up events and meeting people where they're at is a huge piece of this. And you're definitely at the time in the process where investing, I mean, time and just the thinking about the resources to get the word out is essential for this piece. And I think it's a huge benefit that you're going into warm months because you'll have lots of gatherings of folks.
Does anyone know how many unique email addresses for township residents we have? And
No?
That was a gasp.
Oh.
and when they've gone to the survey, have you asked them to opt in to be, to solicit back
So-
information to them?
Of that 600 respondents, I think 200, 300 have put in their emails. So we have that list, and this is a shortcoming. I haven't been able to get those email blasts out and things like that. But again, having this public engagement plan is going to get the word out, building for this big meeting. Monica?
Thank you. I was just saying, I was thinking we're doing this right now with the prop plan, and we're in the same situation where we're thinking of outreach, and we're especially trying to target seniors. So we're talking about how to target the senior groups, how to get in touch with them. Because again, we had a meeting last week and there were hardly any residents there. And I did hear from a few senior residents saying they didn't have computers, they didn't have emails, they just lived without technology this far. They had no plans on using it. So I just keep that type of outreach. It has to be creative for the seniors, and I don't know, maybe it could somehow be coordinated with the prop plan. The same ideas, same type of discussion. Thank you.
I was going to say the comment light is lit. This is from Trevor Dombach to reach the people with young children who may not attend sporting events and or other township events, is putting flyers at playgrounds and or daycares within the township. Thanks, Trevor.
The refuse and recycling bill comes out quarterly, whether you paid it for the whole year or by quarter. And wasn't there just a flyer in the last one for the rec plan? Or I forget the acronym for it. The prop.
The prop plan,
Prop.
PROT.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just so you know, that I'm on the subcommittee for finance. That may change.
Because there's
We'll leave it at that.
Right.
One question that has nothing to do with communication. And maybe I missed it in a previous meeting. Are we updating the Township's Act 537 plan with this comp plan?
Yes, no, kind of. We're setting the stage for that. Yes. And that's actually in the next, that's a perfect segue
Into our
to
next
the
meeting of land
utility
use
section.
or utility section?
Yeah. I appreciate all the comments on public engagement, and we'll certainly take all the comments, and we're going to build a public engagement plan and strategy. And I really like the idea of building towards this big meeting at the end, building the awareness through small interactive things, and then having a bigger event at the end. But we have 25 minutes to get through community utilities.
Talk fast.
Yes, I will try. I will try not to ramble as much. So community utilities, let me go back. We're going to put exactly what we have for natural resources on the website as comment forms. It seems like everybody's kind of on board with that for resource protection. So for community utilities, the three big ones are water, wastewater, and stormwater. Broadband and renewable energy are topics that came up through the working groups as things to talk about. So we may, as we kind of go through this, that may be something that kind of bubbles to the surface. We have the working group recommendations. Hannah was involved in the working group, so I'm going to turn it over to Hannah to kind of go over this. We do have a prioritization. Let's try one and then see how we do on time. Maybe just discuss, but with that, I'll hand it to Hannah.
Yeah, I think basically all I wanted to share before we open it up for discussion and then the subsequent prioritization is that this does represent, from the previous slide, a more expansive view of community utilities, and definitely the space around broadband and alternative energy in comp plans through the MPC. You can add an additional energy chapter or considerations around energy and environment in that space, but they can also obviously within an implementable plan model be integrated in this way. So there's, I think we definitely heard the broadband discussion loud and clear during the working groups, in addition to a lot of the infrastructure capacity. So I think given the time, if there's, and how this process is advancing, I think hearing feedback from the various groups and then trying out the prioritization, but happy to answer any questions with additional details.
So I think probably the best way to do this is we can talk about community utilities kind of in an overarching section now, and then we can get into more detail for each topic area. The way we structured the meetings was we open it to BOC to comment on utilities. So if there's anything that jumps out or want to talk about as the BOC to share with the Planning Commission, please jump in now.
I'll jump in just with one question. Solar is listed as an alternative energy potential in the township. I know solar is a big issue in the development community, big solar farms in the news up in the Poconos. I don't know if it's been discussed under this category or if it's somewhere else, but I think it's something we need to look at and its impact on our open space.
Yeah, so utility scale versus residential, I think is the big distinction there.
And I can just add that this was a more general category for alternative options. The concept of potentially this transitioning into recommendation or comment on solar farms, I think that's definitely something to discuss and explore how that gets treated.
I'm curious about the Act 537.
So we need to update it since the authority was dissolved. DEP requested an updated 537 plan. It didn't make sense to move the 537 plan with the comp plan before the comp plan. So the idea is to use the comp plan as the groundwork for that update to the 537 plan. Do a lot of the mapping, and there's background information in 537 plans. All of that will be done as part of the comp plan. And then hopefully it's a 10-minute cut and paste job and we're done.
In terms of, sewage facilities, I think we all know Klein's Island is tapped out. And from what I've heard, Whitehall, Copley doesn't have capacity nearby. But we're in an interesting situation. I've attended, various seminars over the years and whatnot, and some township officials, they don't want sewage facilities extended because they don't want the cost. They don't have the revenue to install it, and also they don't want the development associated with the public sewers. I don't know what South Whitehall. I've heard numerous officials say that for municipalities, but you know, it is something we have to look at because we are a growing township. We do need to provide sewer services.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, do you want to keep putting sewer and septic systems in the ground, or do you want to treat it and release it in a manner that's probably more appropriate at this day and age?
Yeah, and the important part for the evaluation, the benefits of sewer and getting off of septic and onto sewer, you know, there's documented benefits, particularly in dense areas. So those are things that I think the comp plan has an opportunity to present both sides of that story. So that, you know, the idea is to provide information for the decision makers. So when the decision makers have come, you know, it comes time to make a decision, they have as much information as they can.
And land-based alternatives aren't always the best answer either. I mean, a lot of people don't want a spray field, but by their houses too, you know. So it's weighing, you know, public sewer versus the not public sewer.
Then we need to factor in the township's financial cost. I mean, there's going to be a huge investment on the township's part.
And
so
again,
for
that
the
was one
economic-
of the goals from before, was the financially responsible manner. And that also ties to the economic modeling piece, was in, you know, looking at capacity, sense to use capacity where capacity is available, are all things that absolutely should be.
The first one says evaluate aging septic systems. It could also be water systems. We're having water main breaks on a regular basis almost now. Got some aging infrastructure that be replaced before expansion.
Yeah. I'm tempted to call an audible and just kind of go through and discuss as opposed to prioritize. Is that it? Okay.
It's your show.
Would you recommend then sending out the Mentimeter for prioritization by the Planning Commission after, since they're the
Yeah,
ones
let's
who are?
do that. We'll kind of go over everything tonight, and then we'll send the Mentimeter out and get the prioritization. We'll use that along with all the comments from tonight to come back with the excellent idea. Thank you, Hannah.
Yeah, we went sideways a little bit, but it was valuable.
No, it was great.
It was valuable conversation to have,
Yep, absolutely.
especially as we onboard new members here. So it's getting everybody up to speed.
Yep. So another piece of the overall community utilities shows up here, and then it also shows up in some of the other sections, is the capital improvements plan. It's something that the working groups recommended, and it's again in the, I think it's under the water system. Along the lines of providing information for decision makers, capital improvement plan is one of those information items for decision makers. They can go through that plan, see what was you know, what was on the plan, what's off the plan, where was it prioritized. So again, that the importance of that, it's an important thing to consider as we move through. The growth areas with the land use plan, once we get to the land use plan, we'll identify different areas. The idea of the concept of broadband and evaluating, a lot of that is outside of the township's purview. We're kind of at the mercy, but along the lines of getting a seat at the table and having those conversations is the important part of it. You know, those utilities, just like gas and broadband, they're looking at a customer base. It's economic sense for them to run it, and they're going to make money on it. They're going to run it and make money on it. So if we have a package that identifies areas that may not have a service but have a certain number of density or whatever they're looking for, something we can do to add to that, or at least provide that information.
And I would just quickly add there very briefly, with the Federal Infrastructure Act, the Bipartisan Federal Infrastructure Act, there's lots of money coming through for broadband. And all communities should be thinking about how to take advantage of that.
Quick question under broadband, how does low density cellular or 5G impact broadband, and what are we considering in terms of protecting neighborhoods from transmitters and things of that nature that come with?
I don't know, but yeah, it's something worth looking into for sure. Yeah, and again, we can dive into the working group. Do you have any?
I would just say there are model ordinances for municipalities to regulate 5G. It's a fairly limited ability to regulate. I'm sure the Planning Commission can speak to that based on how our state approaches it. But I think there are some good examples in communities across the Commonwealth to look at.
So moving on to water. So backing up, when we shared the agenda and materials, we took these sections out because we felt that it was more readable than that working outline, which was pretty extensive. So you have this as a handout. So as you're going through the prioritization, you can refer to this handout. With regards to water, and I guess the first one is kind of an overall goal, looking at land use and infrastructure. Tying those two together is important. I don't know if there's any, I don't want to go into all of these in detail, but if there's any comments on the water system, we heard the aging infrastructure as a priority. Here's the capital improvements plan mentioned. One of the things that is talked about from future LV is quality and quantity of groundwater. It talks to the sources of water and protecting those as well. Then on to wastewater. Oh, sorry.
How well do you think we succeeded in achieving some of those goals or recommendations from the 2009 plan? Or are we revamping them, pushing them into this current?
So this came up early in the process, is how did we do implementing, but we didn't really have any mechanism to track. And a lot of the conversation of having this implementable plan and that re-examination report is a direct result of that, because moving forward for the future, again, commissions having the ability to look back and say, all right, they had this in the comp plan, what did they do with it? Right now, a lot of these recommendations, maybe we talked to the board about it, but it wasn't documented. And it just wasn't the right time for some reason, but it wasn't documented. So the idea of with using this plan moving forward is having that re-examination report, having that implementable plan, so that when that question comes up, we can can say, this is what happened. And the boards in the future, again, getting information, they can pull it up and say, all right, the board in 2022 looked into this and this is what they came up with. Has that changed? Or is it still the same, or should we look into it? So the idea of evaluating how we did on all these past ones, it wasn't structured in a way that we could easily evaluate. So the idea is take that recommendation and take those concerns.
I think just from my perspective, an important goal to have there with water is ensuring that there's recharge zones as well as some other protective efforts. You know, we're blessed in Pennsylvania with being a very, very wet state, but then you're putting straws into the ground.
So moving on to wastewater, again, there's the 537 plan mentioned from the 2009 plan. Looking at a capital improvement plan. Have considered developing a landfill policy. Not exactly sure where from. Into that. So these are things that, as the planning commission goes through, you can prioritize these through the Mentimetering. That way, when we're evaluating it and putting it together, synthesize all of this. I think with regards to wastewater, you know, updating the 537 plan, aging infrastructure is another issue. One of the biggest issues with Klein's Island is infiltration. Having a plan in place to stop water from getting into the bush. And that's going to help the future of the plan. Something that should be worked into as a record.
Does that involve, you know, camera inspecting our public sewers, finding where the holes are, and then?
Yep, lining, and then also manhole covers, and you know, there's a whole program.
We're doing that now.
Yeah, in some places, and looking to ramp it up. And it's again working with Public Works.
We even do on-lot inspections for lateral, correct? A couple of years back, where they went through everything to check.
There was talk of a ordinance, and I'm not, you know, it's kind of a little bit out of my wheelhouse. But a lateral inspection as part of a home sale, so that we get from the curb stop to the house, we get that information. There's a whole lead and copper push, and they want the township to evaluate private property owners' lines. Again, I just know that much of it, so.
Are there any sections in the township that fall under the MS4?
The whole township.
The whole township?
Yeah, that's the next slide.
Oh.
Stormwater.
I was just going to mention sanitary laterals to homes. That's important. I'm on the Shade Tree Commission, and I remember some laterals had roots going into the.
So stormwater, there's not a ton of recommendations on here from the last plan. So this is perhaps an area that we can beef up, and, you know, it may be, you know, when you rank and prioritize, we'll take that and we'll come up with kind of a revised portion of this, and then again, taking the comments on additional things that we can add to it. Here we talk about groundwater recharge.
In terms of stormwater, LVPC, the county has an Act 167 that's very robust. And then any project over an acre has to go through the conservation district and DEP, which is very strict.
On top of the
Criteria.
township rules of infiltration per household, we've caught up pretty well with the recharge at this point. LVPC, LCCD, and township.
And I don't know if this is where it comes in, but one of the things that we've talked about with regards to floodplain study was, and I think it's the 167 plan that's done by Watershed. LVPC just updated the Monocacy Creek Watershed Plan. And I believe the Jordan Creek Watershed Plan hasn't been updated since. Exactly. But I believe it's older,
I think it's 20 years,
20 years.
1,000.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
No,
I'm pretty sure it's like 99, 2000.
okay. So there's an opportunity to potentially look at the entire watershed, similar to what LVPC did with. One of the things that came out of that plan was the green infrastructure plan. I think, was it a separate plan or it came out of that process?
It was one for each county.
Okay. We finished 3 minutes early.
We have a lot of watersheds.
We do have a lot of work.
If I can just because we spent time going through the resource protection and you saw how these became more bucketed and provided more of a framework and then went into the implementation strategies. I think one of the great opportunities is we're obviously going to take these and transform them into a more usable implementable format. So to the how do we hold ourselves accountable? I think we can obviously go beyond these as well. So just if you take another look at the resource protection, how that's structured, would love to hear how that's resonating as an organizational structure as we continue to move forward. Thank you.
I do want to open it up to the caller. We have one out there and I don't want to miss any comments. So caller one, did you have any comments on community utilities?
No comments.
Okay, well, thank you for coming.
So as we go through this process, the next meeting we'll go over community utilities based on prioritization conversations tonight. Also start taking notes if there's things that are missing so that when we have that conversation next month, we can start to build some of that into the plan. We will certainly think about that as staff, and again, if you have comments or questions, reach out to us. You don't have to wait a month. Shoot me an email. Thank you.
To adjourn.
Thank you.
All in favor?
I
think Diane motioned.
Believe he stays in that room like